In this interview we hear the conversation turned toward Trump's close ties to the Russian oligarchs. Some of the ideas visited here include Trump's support among the Tea Party, evangelicals, oligarchs, Fox News followers. In terms of the Fox News bubble, has Fox become the de facto voice of the Republican Party, and as such a conduit of the Russian oligarchy and Putin via President Trump? It's also worthwhile to listen closely to these key words: attack, Constitutional Convention, evangelicals, Mueller, Pearl Harbor, Putin, racism, treason, Trump Tower meeting. Make up your own mind. There's plenty here to cause concern with the direction of the United States political system on this eve of the 4th of July, 2018.
Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the upcoming summit in Helsinki, Finland on July the 16th between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, in which an ignorant, insecure and possibly compromised American president will be sitting down with an extremely clever and utterly ruthless former KGB thug who, if he does not already control Trump, will surely have him wrapped around his finger in Helsinki. A veteran CIA officer, Robert Baer, who is now the National Security Affairs Analyst at CNN, joins us to discuss why our president, who has trashed, ignored and belittled America's intelligence agencies, appears to defer to Russia's leader, who has built an undemocratic kleptocracy regulated by former intelligence officials and cronies. We will explore the possibility that Trump is some kind of Manchurian candidate who either was recruited by the Kremlin or who bought into their worldview and is now doing the bidding of Moscow while sitting in the Oval Office, and how, as the Mueller inquiry investigates Trump's financial ties, it appears the wannabe billionaire Trump was rescued by cash from real billionaires in Russia close to Putin. Having incessantly praised Putin while insulting America's allies at every opportunity, we will look into what it will take in terms of smoking guns to convince Republicans in Congress to stop enabling the destruction of America, and for Trump's base locked inside the Fox News bubble to realize their hero is a traitor. Then we will speak with Ambassador Derek Shearer, a former U.S. ambassador to Finland who is currently Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College, where he serves as Director of the McKinnon Center for Global Affairs. He joins us to discuss the summit he arranged in Helsinki in 1997 between President Clinton and President Yeltsin, and what is likely to emerge from a meeting with an adversarial leader who helped elect the American president he is conducting secret talks with. Our leader, who will be coming to Helsinki from a NATO summit of America's allies, who are likely to have been as rattled by Trump's hostility and rudeness towards them as the participants at the recent G7 summit in Canada were. And joining us on the eve of this 4th of July is Robert Baer, one of the most accomplished agents in CIA history and the winner of the Career Intelligence Medal. He's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, including See No Evil and Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Soul for Saudi Crude. He's considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Middle East and is the current National Security Affairs Analyst for CNN, and his latest book is The Perfect Kill, 21 Laws for Assassinations. Welcome to Background Briefing, Robert Baer.
Thank you.
And on the eve of this 4th of July, I know it sounds a little perverse on the day that we celebrate the American Revolution and independence from the British, and it's generally a day of patriotism with lots of red, white, and blue. And on this day, my main question would be, we have a very strange situation where the President of the United States appears in many ways to be out of step with American patriotism, in the sense that we're not even sure whether or not he's serving the interests of the United States or whether he is serving the interests of Russia. And that's an extraordinary situation to be in. As a former frontline soldier in the Cold War and in protecting America, what's your take on this? Do you share my concerns that there are so many doubts about this president and his allegiances that we need to know more?
Well, I have a question, a couple things, and why is he dismantling everything we've built up since 1945, the end of World War II, from NATO to the European Union to the G7, right down the line, and including the World Trade Organization. I mean, this is sort of, generations after generations of Americans built this up, and now, and let's not forget that Russia is not part of NATO, and it's not part of the G7 either, nor is it part of any of these other trade agreements or military alliances, and dismantling them fits right in with Vladimir Putin's agenda, the Russian agenda. So it's the most bizarre thing that I could imagine. I mean, clearly it's not helping our economy, starting a trade war. It's benefiting Russia. And Trump is, in the middle of this. He picks a fight with Canada, our best ally, certainly not a national security threat, and then flies off to Helsinki to meet with Vladimir Putin, which, by the way, has terrified the Europeans. And then number two is we still don't know what his connections with Russia are. This goes way back. A lot of Europeans think he's an Arm & Hammer, the head of Oxy that was very close to the Soviet regime, did their bidding, an unwitting agent of influence. So much of Trump's money comes from Russia. It was filtered through the Russian mob, but ultimately was invested with the green light from Moscow, from the KGB. So you have all these questions on this fourth, and why, and the Europeans, by the way, are terrified. They don't know where his allegiances are. He is yet to prove that he can follow an American national security policy which is in line with our traditional interests.
Well, recently he tweeted out that Russia had nothing to do with meddling in our elections. He believes Vladimir Putin, not the U.S. intelligence services that you used to belong to. So how does that strike you?
Well, I mean, that's something a Manchurian candidate would say. I mean, you've got every single intelligence agency in the United States has proof positive it was the Russians running these troll factories. And right down the line, so taking the side of a KGB agent really makes you question his loyalties. And let's not forget his administration as well. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has confirmed it was the Russians. So is the Senate, so is the House. Everybody in the United States except Donald Trump has acknowledged the Russians meddled in our elections, which, Ian, I've got to say right now is starting to look like an attack worse than Pearl Harbor. So yes, we should be questioning what is going on in this man's head.
Well, you mentioned Arm & Hammer and his connections to the Kremlin. And my understanding, in fact, I spoke with General William Odom, who was the former head of the National Security Agency, many years ago. Unfortunately, General Odom's not with us anymore. But he told me that he had the unenviable task of telling Ronald Reagan, soon to be President Reagan, in the transition, when he was briefing him as the head of the National Security Agency, that Reagan's friend, Arm & Hammer, was a Russian asset, or a Soviet asset, I guess, in those days. And apparently Reagan was pretty shaken by that news.
Well, here's the word the KGB uses for somebody like Trump, and that's a trusted contact. There's nothing signed on the bottom line. There's a confluence of interests. Nothing's ever acknowledged. But the Russians know Trump well enough that he's yet and will never take an anti-Russian line. So any support they can put his way is fine. And there doesn't need to be a conspiracy. It doesn't need to be the Manchurian candidate. You just know somebody like this. They know somebody like this that just like Arm & Hammer will parrot the Soviet or now the Russian line. And there's a half a dozen prominent Americans, the Russians, the Soviet, the KGB identified over the years that are trusted contacts. That they believe that Russian interests coincide with ours, and they supported him, and they never stopped. And you don't have to have any sort of secret communications. You don't have to have money passing back and forth. You just have to be sure of your man. I mean, the fact that, whatever, whether it's about money, about investments, about Russians buying property from Trump, it really doesn't matter, because he understands and the Russians understand they need each other.
And again, I'm speaking with Robert Baer, one of the most accomplished agents in CIA history and the winner of the Career Intelligence Medal. He's the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, including See No Evil and Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Soul for Saudi Crude. He's considered one of the world's foremost authorities on the Middle East and is the current national security affairs analyst for CNN. And his latest book is The Perfect Kill, 21 Laws for Assassinations. And on the eve of this 4th of July, we are exploring the extraordinary possibility that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is a traitor, or at least is not entirely doing his patriotic duty both as Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States. And there's ample evidence that he has this peculiar affection for Putin and makes excuses for him all the time. But when I mentioned earlier, Bob, about Trump's recent tweet saying that Putin assures him that he didn't meddle in our elections, Trump is making for excuses for a man and suggesting he's telling the truth and our intelligence services are lying, when Putin is an amazing liar. I mean, so is Trump, of course, but Putin lied about the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine, lied about the green men going into Crimea, lies about the fact that the Russians are involved in a low-intensity warfare in Ukraine, lies about the use of chemical weapons by Assad in Syria, lies about Russian bombing of hospitals and killing civilians in Syria, etc., etc. So that's what I find extraordinary. I mean, our guy's a serial liar, but the idea that our serial liar would trust Putin and believe him as opposed to the intelligence services that serve the President of the United States and the executive branch.
Well, Ian, it's as bad as if Roosevelt had said, well, it wasn't the Japanese that attacked Pearl Harbor, and I'm going to fly to Tokyo and, make a big deal with them, cut some deal with them. It's crazy. It's crazy. I have never seen anything like it. There's all sorts of things, problems with the Atlantic Alliance, but simply to take it down and start talking about pulling out of NATO our troops because it's expensive, right down the line. And Putin is a professional liar. He's an ex-intelligence officer who continues to run Russia as an autocrat and as a KGB thug. Not only that, he came into power by blowing up apartment buildings in his own country and blaming the Chechens and assassinating people in Britain with a nerve agent that could have only been approved by Putin. So for our president to lie with an assassin like this is bad news.
Well, at the G7, where Trump, basically his boorish and disruptive behavior essentially ruined it, and then he walked off and then rescinded whatever the communique was that they all jointly agreed to. But the Brits were at that G7. They wanted to get a G7 resolution condemning Russia for the use of a nerve agent against a Russian exile on British soil. So obviously Trump knew that that was the British intention. And just before he left for the G7, out of nowhere, he says that Russia should be admitted to the G7. And that clearly completely undercut Theresa May. So my question would be, you recall a year or so ago, there were inquiries into what went on during the campaign between Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of President Trump, and Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador. And the reports basically concluded that what Kushner was trying to do was set up a back channel to Russia, a dedicated back channel to communicate directly with the Russians. And that apparently was why he met with Kislyak. So is it possible that Trump has a back channel? Because
Part 2 follows. Part 2 follows.